Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Zastrow with Astronomy magazine. I'm a senior editor there, and I'm here with Jack Daleo with Flying Magazine. And we're going to preview some of the upcoming launches that we have for 2025. Obviously, we are living in an age of unprecedented launch activity. It's frankly hard to keep track of all of them. So, we're going to try to do a rundown here and preview some of the most exciting launches that we have coming up, both from a commercial standpoint and also from a scientific standpoint. So, even right now, as we are talking, we have missions on their way to the moon. We had just recently the Blue Ghost 1 mission, which successfully launched and is now en route to the moon. Jack, can you talk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, like you said, it's an exciting time for spaceflight. It's the fourth year in a row that we've set a record for orbital launch attempts. We've got this Blue Ghost Mission 1 up there right now. This is actually a joint mission. SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket launched two lunar landers. So Blue Ghost, that's made by Firefly Aerospace, and another lander called Resilience from a Japanese company called iSpace. That Blue Ghost mission orbited the Earth for a few weeks, and earlier this month, it finally reached lunar orbit. That's targeted to land on the moon March 2nd and spend about 2 weeks there. That's one lunar day. That's carrying NASA science equipment, and it's going to perform a bunch of experiments up there. Resilience is also headed for a lunar landing. It's going to deploy a rover called Tenacious. Some fun naming conventions there. And Resilience actually made a lunar flyby this month as well. iSpace is expecting that to land in early May. So either of those two missions could be the second to land a private lunar lander on the moon. The first company to do that was Intuitive Machines, based out of Houston just over a year ago. That company is backed by NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, and they just launched the second mission yesterday, IM-2. That's also on SpaceX's Falcon 9. So that first mission, IM-1, was just a simple soft moon landing. It was considered a success. But this time, the goal is to actually drill into the surface of the moon at the South Pole. And that'll also be carrying NASA's Lunar Trailblazer orbiter, which is designed to map out all the water on the moon. But Mark, there are some more launches coming up that we got to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. We have one, I mean, potentially as soon as tonight, one launch with two different NASA science missions. One of them is called SphereX, and that one is actually a cosmology telescope. It's going to be mapping the entire sky and mapping almost half a billion galaxies all around the sky, and also taking spectra of them in the near infrared. And the point of doing this, of looking at all these galaxies and mapping them, is that by looking back into time, we can kind of track the expansion of the universe, how the universe has evolved. So this is really a cosmology focused mission that's going to be doing an enormous survey. As opposed to, say, telescopes like the Hubble or the James Webb Space Telescope, which are really kind of, you point them at a target of interest. This one is looking all over the sky. Really exciting mission that's been in the works for a while. And on that same rocket, actually, we have Punch, which is a mission that is going to study our closest star, well, the sun. So this is actually a heliophysics mission, and it's going to be looking at the outermost part of the sun's atmosphere, what we call the corona. This is what you can see during a total solar eclipse. This glowing layer of plasma that kind of surrounds the sun, but it's really this extremely hot gas that is streaming off of the sun and eventually becoming the solar wind, which it permeates the entire solar system. And so this mission is really kind of looking at the physics there, really how the corona turns into the solar wind, how all that energy gets converted into the solar wind. And of course, when the solar wind picks up, you could say, when there are coronal mass ejections carried in the solar wind to Earth, that is when we get space weather, geomagnetic storms, aurora, impacts on GPS and communications, etc. So untangling all of that physics kind of is one of the aims of this mission. So both of those missions launching on the same rocket tonight from Vandenberg Space Force Base, or at least as early as tonight.
Right, we've got missions to study the moon, missions to study the sun. And I don't think you can talk about what's going on in space flight right now without talking about SpaceX's Starship. Um, SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets are pretty dominant in the spaceflight arena. They've accounted for the bulk of US launches last year. But SpaceX is also building Starship, which, for those who are unacquainted, is the largest rocket to ever fly. It stands about 400 feet tall with both stages stacked. And it's actually flown once already this year. That was Flight 7 in January, which exploded and ended in an FAA investigation. So the rocket's grounded for now, but it's expected to fly again in the next few months. SpaceX is aiming for 25 Starship test flights in 2025. It'll need FAA approval for that, but the FAA has already released a draft environmental assessment that calls for 25 launches and 50 landings. That's 25 for each of the two stages, the Starship upper stage and the lower stage Super Heavy booster. So one of the goals that SpaceX has in 2025 is to roll out more powerful versions of Starship. Block 1, the initial version, flew on the first 6 test flights, and we saw Block 2 fly on Flight 7. Block 3 is still coming. That's expected to be an even taller and more powerful version of Starship. Another milestone that they're aiming for is full reusability, launching and catching both Super Heavy and the Starship upper stage from the launch pad that they launched from. Why is that important? Well, if you want to launch 25 times a year, like SpaceX is trying to do, you could use 25 different rockets or use the same rocket 25 times. So the idea is to be able to bring that rocket back to the launch pad, refurbish it, and get it ready for another mission quickly, within days instead of months. Another big thing that SpaceX is trying to do this year, actually, let me just go back to the Starship stuff. Um, so we saw SpaceX last year on test flight 6 catch the Super Heavy booster from midair using a pair of metal arms. That was an unprecedented maneuver, a historic maneuver, the first time that's ever been done, and they achieved that on the first try. So that bodes well for what they might be able to do this year. Flight 7 was another booster catch attempt that failed, but the goal is to catch Super Heavy again, and if that goes well, potentially catch Starship too. The last big thing that SpaceX is trying to do this year as an in-orbit propellant transfer demonstration. Why do we need that? So SpaceX is under contract with NASA to build a human landing system version of Starship for Artemis 3. That's a lunar landing scheduled for mid-2027. To get to the moon, Starship will need to launch with more fuel than it can actually carry. So it'll need to stop at a fuel depot in orbit to fuel up. The expectation is that in the next few months, SpaceX will launch 2 Starships to orbit, mate them, and demonstrate that it's possible for a future human landing system version of Starship to fuel up and be able to zip astronauts over to the moon. So this is all building up to what SpaceX hopes will be an uncrewed demonstration flight of Starship to the moon later this year or early next. But Mark, Starship is not the only massive rocket that's flying right now.
That's right. I mean, you also have to talk about the SpaceX competitor, which is Blue Origin, and their new heavy lift rocket, New Glenn. Up to until late last year or early this year, the Blue Origin's flights had essentially been suborbital rockets with the New Shepard rocket, which and mainly they were essentially space tourism flights. But now having this orbital launcher is a huge step forward in capability for Blue Origin. And that's important because they are also part of the Artemis program. They are also being contracted, they have been contracted by NASA to be able to deliver cargo and eventually to also build a crewed lander to deliver Artemis astronauts. So to see this heavy lift rocket take flight is a big step for Blue Origin. You had the maiden flight of New Glenn, which was a success in that it reached orbit. It was carrying what's called Blue Ring, which is essentially Blue Origin's spacecraft platform. So this is like a space logistics and delivery platform. It's really part of their end-to-end infrastructure that they are trying to build out here. It supports satellites that can be mounted to it. They can be up to 3 tons of payload, and the platform, the Blue Ring platform, can also act as a space tug, moving craft from orbit to orbit, whatever wherever they may need to go. It can also it is also intended to be able to refuel in orbit as well to kind of continuously serve in this space tug role. And this is a platform that Blue Origin has built, but it's not only for Blue Origin rockets. It can also be launched on any other launch vehicle. They designed it that way to be interoperable. So this is really part of the business that Blue Origin is trying to build out here. The only sort of caveat or thing that wasn't a success was that the booster landing did not succeed. This was their first time attempting a landing on their seaborne platform, but that honestly is not a surprise. It took SpaceX many times to get this right as well. It's a very difficult thing. And they intend to make modifications for their second launch. Now, we don't have a launch date for their second launch yet, but they're targeting late spring. It's not entirely clear what payload might be on it. It could wind up just being a mass simulator. NASA did have a mission called Escapade that they were originally going to fly on the first New Glenn launch, and it may or may not wind up on the second one. Well, that is yet to be determined, but clearly it's a very important step to see this continue for what the current Artemis architecture is. It's a key component. Of course, the big question here is the Artemis architecture going to remain the same going forward? Jack, what's your take on this? There's a lot here.
It's something that's too early to answer right now, I think. For one, we've got this tight budget environment. The projected budget for NASA in 2025, experts say, doesn't keep up with inflation. It doesn't give them enough money to be able to pursue all of the projects that they want to. And there might need to be cuts in certain places. That could be Artemis, it could be elsewhere. We also have a new administration that's coming in that has already made it known that it wants to cut as many NASA personnel as possible. And that administration is going to come with a new NASA chief, probably Jared Isaacman, who is President Donald Trump's nominee to be the next NASA administrator. Isaacman has already made some comments about the Space Launch System. That is the NASA rocket that's assigned to launch Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. He's called that outrageously expensive, in his words. And Isaacman has also indicated recently that he would back the Trump administration's agenda. And Trump and Elon Musk, who is the CEO of SpaceX, have made comments about skipping over the moon and potentially going straight to Mars. So you add to that the concerns about a potential conflict of interest with Elon Musk and SpaceX. His role within the Trump administration is a bit unclear right now. And there's a lot that is in flux at the moment. We could certainly see things remain the same, but don't be surprised if there is a shakeup to the Artemis architecture.
Yeah, it's really when you look at what the SLS is, it is increasingly a kind of a relic of a pre-reusable era, right? I mean, it's basically taking, technology that was built for the space shuttle, kind of packing it together. And it's certainly a very powerful rocket, but the cost for being something that is a single-use rocket is very, very difficult to support for any purpose besides the Artemis program. Now, of course, there are a lot of complications, right? In terms of if it were to be canceled, because that is the big question. Will SLS simply be canceled at this point? Could it be an all SpaceX architecture, a full Starship architecture for the Artemis program? Um, there are what you're hearing from what we're hearing from the contractors involved in SLS are, of course, that this is the fastest way to get to the moon, and that is probably going to play a role, right? Like, I mean, how quickly does the Trump administration intend to get back? And that certainly, if that's the fastest way, then perhaps we'll see that continue to be used. But certainly looking ahead, the reusability aspect is paramount, and SLS already, even if it survives, is kind of a dead rocket walking essentially. It's not clear that there's any purpose for it beyond the Artemis program.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody can predict what exactly is going to happen next. But I think it is worth noting that Boeing recently, one of the contractors for the SLS, announced layoffs of hundreds of workers on its SLS team. So it could be an indicator of what contractors think that NASA is going to do.
Yep. Yep. A lot, a lot still to be decided. But there are, of course, companies besides SpaceX and Blue Origin out there. There's a whole ecosystem of other commercial firms that are opening up, including a couple down under that maybe should be more on people's radars. Jack, can you walk us through that?
I believe you're talking about Rocket Lab, Mark.
That's
That is
yes.
another company that's building a massive rocket. It's called Neutron. It's two stages that stand about 140 feet tall. It's designed to send about 28,000 pounds of cargo to low Earth orbit. Rocket Lab describes this thing as a mega constellation launcher, satellite constellations, but it can also be used for cargo resupply to the ISS, and eventually, potentially, human spaceflight missions and potentially missions to other planets. It's partially reusable. They plan to return the first stage of Neutron to the launch site, just like SpaceX is doing with Super Heavy. They've already got a commercial customer. It's a confidential one, but they have announced the customer in this past November. And they've been picked by NASA to provide rideshare launch services. So that's another company to keep an eye on. They've got the engine for Neutron built. It powered on for the first time last year, and they're now working to get those two rocket stages in the engine validated and get some approval for launch. They do most of their launches out of New Zealand, but they're building another launch complex called Launch Complex 3 in Virginia, actually. And that's the expected launch site for Neutron. That being said, though, Rocket Lab might get a new neighbor down under soon because there's another company called Gilmore Space. It's an Australian company, and they're aiming to be the first company to launch an Australian-made rocket from Australian soil. So earlier this month, it was reported that that mission, it's called Ares Test Flight 1, got the green light from Australia's aviation regulator. So that could fly in the next few months. But Mark, what is going on in other parts of the world?
There is a lot going on in other parts of the world. Obviously, you got to talk about China, um, as really ramping up their efforts. We have seen China hit some really big milestones. First is looking on the sort of the scientific exploration side of things. They have now made multiple robotic landings on the moon, including the first ever landing on the far side back in 2019. Um, they've also landed a rover on Mars with Tianwen-1 in 2021. And this year, we're getting Tianwen-2, which is an asteroid sample return mission. It's scheduled to launch in May. And this is a really interesting, really ambitious mission. So it's going to be headed to a near Earth asteroid called Kamo called called Kamo Oalewa in 2026 is when it's going to arrive. Let me do that again. So this is a really interesting and ambitious mission. It's actually headed to a near-Earth asteroid called Kamo Oalewa, which it will arrive at in 2026. And this asteroid is about 40 to 100 meters long, which is very similar actually in size to the estimates that we currently have for the asteroid 2024 YR4, which you may have heard of, because that is the one that has a right now approximately 3% chance of hitting Earth in 2032, late 2032. And so that size of asteroid is actually a good deal smaller than the other asteroids that have been targeted by previous sample return missions. So you had Japan's Hayabusa 2 mission, and that was followed by NASA's Osiris Rex. Sorry. So that size range is actually a good deal smaller than the other asteroids that have been targeted by previous sample return missions. So you had the Japanese Hayabusa 2 mission, which went to Ryugu, and then NASA had Osiris Rex, which went to Bennu. And both of those were, I mean, an order of magnitude, like 10 times larger, kilometer-ish in size. So this is this is a sample return mission. So it's going to actually land on the asteroid. And it's actually going to do it in a couple different ways. One is the same way that the Japanese Hayabusa 2 mission and Osiris Rex did, which is called a touch and go. And it's exactly as you would expect. It just kind of lands down on the surface, which is, asteroids really are just giant rubble piles that are very loosely bound by gravity. You punch the surface of it, and it really just your hand would go right into it. And so that's what these missions have done is essentially stick a probe just right into the asteroid and grab some samples, some soil, some rocks, and pull it back up. But the Chinese mission is actually going to try another approach as well, which is called anchor and attach. And so I'm very intrigued to see how this mechanism works to be able to anchor itself to such a loosely bound object, to try to get a better grip and return more samples. So that's going to be a groundbreaking aspect of that mission. But beyond the exploration side, China also has is trying to play catch up really with SpaceX. They currently are revamping the Long March 9 booster design, which has been in the works for a long time. They've basically converted it to be very similar to Starship. They are going to try to build it out in the same way with a booster that can be caught by a tower with arms, Mechazilla style. And to be able to have this super heavy lift rocket for China is actually really important for all of China's future ambitions. It is planning to build an international lunar research station in the 2030s, and that's in partnership with Russia and other nations. That's going to be a huge component of that program. I mean, really, if you look at China in the broad picture, it doesn't have a reusable rocket. And their largest rocket right now is the Long March 5, which is a large rocket, but uh, it cannot be reused. It actually can't even control where it deorbits, which has become an issue in the last few years. That it's making uncontrolled reentries into the atmosphere, and it's large enough that chunks of it are surviving. And so that is the issue of space debris reentering the atmosphere is an issue that is also receiving a lot of attention, and China has come under scrutiny for that. But beyond that venture, there's also the commercial sector in China. I mean, China really is starting to take a page from NASA's playbook and really try to nurture these space startups, loosen regulations, allow commercial companies to work out of government funded launch facilities. Perhaps the most famous commercial Chinese firm is Space Pioneer. You may have seen one of their static fire tests from last year, in June, go viral because that static fire test unfortunately became not so static. This rocket actually came off its restraining bolts essentially and launched when it was not trying to. And it was actually quite near a city, quite near a populated area, and so this was captured in videos from Chinese netizens, and luckily it did come down and it crashed into a mountainside. But so that's worth looking up if you haven't seen it. But there is a whole ecosystem of commercial firms and projects out there in China. One of the interesting dynamics there is that the whole space industry in China is really being funded heavily at a local level. There are multiple local governments in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Wuhan. They're all either building spaceports or attempting to attract space founders and startups, and that's really where a lot of the money is coming from, not necessarily from the central Chinese government. So, for instance, you have one of the Chinese mega constellations that is currently under construction is the Tianfan constellation. That's going to be around 14,000 satellites, so a rival to SpaceX's Starlink, which is going to be 42,000, or at least that's what they've filed for. And they have launched, I think it's up to 4 batches of satellites now for the Tianfan constellation. That is actually primarily funded by the Shanghai government, not the central government. And speaking of mega constellations, I mean, there's also the Guowang Chinese mega constellation, which will be, I think, another 13,000 satellites. So low Earth orbit is filling up very, very quickly. And so we're certainly going to see more launches this year in 2025 of the Tianfan and the Guowang mega constellations. You also have China continuing to make advances in their human spaceflight program, kind of under the radar, maybe to Western audiences, but their Tiangong space station has been continuously crewed since June of 2022. Of course, this space station is nowhere near on the scale of the International Space Station. But obviously, to have that continuous human presence in orbit is critical to sort of building up their capabilities for a human presence in space. Um, you also have, by the way, India's uncrewed test flight, but they're building a crew capsule to prepare for a crewed flight, the Gaganyaan craft that is going to be launched on an uncrewed test flight sometime this year, perhaps as soon as March. But just going back to the Tiangong station, they recently announced that they had a record long spacewalk, a 9-hour long spacewalk, which would break the record that was previously held by US astronauts since 2001. It's only by a few minutes, but clearly something that they wanted to make a point of, I would say. So yeah, a lot of things going on.
Yeah, the general public here might not be tuned into what's happening in China, but I can tell you NASA certainly is. If you listen to their officials talk about their spaceflight programs, things like Mars sample return and landing on the moon, for example, China is always seen as kind of the country to beat. And we've seen programs
Absolutely.
in China and India and these other countries sort of really rapidly catch up to what the US is doing. The advent of reusability cannot be overstated enough how important that is. We've seen that with SpaceX and its Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy. Tying back into what you mentioned there with the Tiangong space station and its continuous occupation, you mentioned that the ISS has been at it longer. NASA has been continuously occupying the ISS for about 25 years now, and we've got SpaceX Falcon 9 and we have SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets um, transporting astronauts to and from the space station. So this is part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. It's a relatively new initiative that started in the past few years. And SpaceX in March is scheduled to complete the next Commercial Crew astronaut rotation mission at the ISS. Those missions are about 6 months each. So if that one is successful, we could get Crew 11 later this year. Now, you can't talk about NASA Commercial Crew without mentioning Starliner, which is Boeing's alternative to SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule. And it's been in the news a lot recently, not always for good reasons. NASA gave both SpaceX and Boeing multi-billion-dollar contracts to perform these commercial crew astronaut rotation services. Dragon has flown 9 times, all 9 commercial crew rotation missions. But Starliner is a different story. It launched in June on its inaugural crewed flight test, but it was not able to bring its crew of 2 astronauts back, NASA astronauts Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore, because it suffered helium leaks and thruster issues. So instead, SpaceX's Crew 9 Dragon capsule is going to be the one that returns those astronauts as soon as Crew 10 arrives at the ISS. And there's no timeline for the next Starliner launch. Boeing recently reported that program just topped $2 billion in losses over its contract value. And there were reports last year that Boeing could look to even sell off its entire space business. So the commercial crew situation over at NASA is definitely one worth keeping an eye on, because the reason NASA wanted both a Crew Dragon and Boeing Starliner is to have an alternative in case something goes wrong. We saw not too long ago NASA astronaut Frank Rubio, who flew up on a Russian Soyuz capsule. That capsule suffered issues and he was stuck, or not stuck. The folks at NASA don't like to use that word, but their stay was extended on the ISS. His stay was extended on the ISS for months. So NASA wants to be able to have another vehicle in case a contingency like that happens. Now there are other vehicles in development that could one day fly to the ISS. One of those is called the Dream Chaser. That's been in development for decades. The manufacturer is Sierra Space. But the demo flight to the International Space Station is scheduled for no earlier than May. NASA is hoping to use the Dream Chaser to fly cargo and supplies to astronauts up in space. We also have a potentially very exciting private astronaut mission that's coming up. as soon as March. It's another SpaceX mission called Fram 2. This would be the sixth private astronaut mission for SpaceX's Dragon, which has flown 3 missions for Axiom Space, the Inspiration 4 all civilian crew in 2021, and the Polaris Dawn mission last year. I actually had the opportunity to speak to Jared Isaacman, Trump's NASA nominee, who's the commander of that mission. Um, and this next mission, Fram 2, would also launch on SpaceX's Falcon 9. The crew would enter SpaceX's Dragon and would fly around the Earth in a 90-degree circular orbit. For context, the previous high circular orbit for a crewed space flight was 65 degrees back in 1963. So this would be the first time that humans would be flying over Earth's north and south poles. Um, they expect to be able to travel between the poles in under an hour. And just some more quick facts about this mission. It was purchased from SpaceX by a crypto entrepreneur named Chun Wang. But the crew also includes a cinematographer, a polar adventurer, and a robotics expert. So quite the mix there. They're going to be studying some mysterious, unexplained green and purple light phenomena that have been spotted above the Arctic and Antarctic. And they're also going to be studying the effects of long-duration space flight, potentially something that could help NASA for missions like Artemis 3 and beyond that.
It's a lot. It's a lot to take in. A lot going on. I mean, just not just on the commercial side, but then also on the scientific side, still a lot of missions, launches yet to come this year. Looking ahead, down in September, we have the NASA IMAP mission, which is short for Interstellar Mapping and Acceleration Probe. And this is another heliophysics mission. It's again going to be looking at the solar wind and how really kind of how it interacts with what we in astronomy would call the interstellar medium. So this is instead of looking at the origin of the solar wind, where it comes from the sun, it's looking outward to where the solar wind runs outside of the solar system and into the material that sort of permeates the space between the stars. So really, this is looking at the outer boundary of the solar system and the physics that are going on there. So that's set to launch in September. Then going back to sort of the commercial side of things, we have the NASA CLIPS program, the Commercial Lunar Payloads program, where NASA is contracting, with firms to deliver craft to the moon. And we have one coming up in November, the Astrobotic Griffin Mission 1. And this is going to be a really key launch for that firm, for Astrobotic, because the Griffin lander is their scaled up lander. They previously launched the Peregrine lander, which was a mission that failed because it never actually left Earth orbit, and so all of the lunar payloads um, burned up in Earth's atmosphere, essentially. This is a much larger lander that they have developed, and originally the prime payload was supposed to be a NASA rover called Viper. This was going to be a rover that was kind of crucial to the Artemis program because it was going to survey the lunar southern regions where all of the, there's so much attention where Artemis is planning to land on, and survey those areas to see how much water is actually there. Of course, if you want to have sustained human presence, you need to have access to water. And the hope is that there are copious amounts of water ice that may be beneath the surface, that may be stored in the shadows of craters, the regions that are permanently in shadow, close to the South Pole. And so this was a very capable, powerful rover that was going to be able to survey and prospect for water. But because of budgetary pressures, even though the rover was completely built and just essentially needed to be integrated into the rocket and tested, NASA effectively said, "We don't have the money to fly and operate it." And so they canceled the mission. The rover is still built, it's sitting in a clean room, and NASA is actually actively, courting other organizations and firms, basically saying, "Hey, we have a free rover. You want it? We'll give it to you for free if you'll operate it and if you'll continue to carry out the original mission that it was designed to do, which is search for water." But because that lander has been taken off the Astrobotic Griffin Mission 1, There is a new startup that has been able to get a lander, be able to get a rover on that lander, taking up that slot. So that's good to see that it's not going to be, uh, they're not going to be forced to fly a mass simulator and land some dead weight on the moon. We still have, looking even further forward, a couple really exciting science missions that were launched in the last couple of years that are currently en route to Jupiter. Of course, when we say en route, what we really mean is that they're flying around the inner solar system, doing flybys of Earth and Venus, trying to build up the momentum and to actually start. To actually slingshot out of the inner solar system and head towards Jupiter. But one of those is the Europa Clipper mission, which is a very exciting NASA mission that is really one of the first missions to try to explicitly look for signs of life and conditions that could support life on Jupiter's icy moon Europa. Now, this is it's going to be an orbiter. It's not a lander, so it won't be able to land on the surface, as was originally the case. A decade ago, that was what the plans were. They were quite ambitious, but this is still going to be a mission that is specifically designed to study its surface, study the water that is actually escaping from the surface through cracks in the ice. So to try to actually get basically fly through the water that came from underneath the surface to see if it has any sort of chemistry that might be indicative of life. That's a really exciting mission. And the European Space Agency also has a mission going to Jupiter right now that launched a couple years ago. That's also right now kind of circling the inner solar system, building up momentum and energy to travel to Jupiter. So later this decade, or and into the next decade, is when we'll start to see results come from those spacecraft, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, Mark, as someone who reports on the human spaceflight side of things, hearing you talk about this stuff is really blowing my mind right now. Just the amount of things, planetary science projects, exploration that's happening right now. I think it is without a doubt one of the most exciting times to be alive to witness spaceflight. Like I said at the beginning, we've set records 4 years in a row for orbital launch activity. Things are only going to ramp up the more reusability we get. And I think it's a bright future for spaceflight, Mark.
I completely agree. It really is a golden age for us at Astronomy Magazine, not just the space exploration side, but also the basic science side, the ground-based astronomy. Even though we have issues with mega constellations, even though the light pollution continues to be an issue, the sheer leaps and capabilities that are coming down the pipeline are really incredible. There really is there has no better time to be a space enthusiast or an astronomy enthusiast.
Yeah, I think if there's one message that we could leave our viewers with, it's look up and enjoy what's happening right now because there might not be another time like it.
Absolutely, totally agree. All right, thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more space waves.